maybe I know this guy. Because I read, I saw your picture.
I think you're supposed to move to the next one.
Hello, hello, can you hear me?
Otherwise I'll become Terry.
Let's see.
Yeah, I didn't know where, I kind of ran the
Hello,
hotel
hello.
at chance.
Oh,
And it was like, where is this
I
place?
tried to.
Here,
The
take
name is
this.
mine. Go on, his name with somebody.
Cheers.
I looked up the map, and before I thought it's it's not really downtown.
I think so, yeah.
So why don't we begin? I don't want that we have so many exciting speakers and events planned for the day. So I'm Mary Yoko Brennan. I'm the Jaroslawski East Asia Japan Chair, kind of a mouthful, at the University of Victoria, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today. I know that there's a lot of competition for this day, the most popular day before the Academy begins tomorrow. And so the fact that there's such a wonderful turnout really warms my heart, as this is such an important topic. And it's wonderful to be able to bring you all together for this day, intensive day in think tank. I wanted to welcome you on behalf of the University of Victoria, the Simon Fraser University and the Beatty School of Management, and Royal Roads University, myself and my co-organizers, Rosalie Dung and Terry Mugan. We have a lot planned for today, but I wanted to sort of set the stage with giving you a little bit of history of how this day came about. Besides the wonderful sponsorship of the other two universities and the Center for Global Studies as well at the University of Victoria and the Academy of Management. So in 2008, after having thought about for a long time what it is to be bicultural, being one myself, I realized that there are lots of different disciplines that have been looking at this phenomenon of biculturalism from a variety of different perspectives. And importantly, from social psychology, there was a lot of empirical work being done on individuals who are bicultural, who have grown up with more than one schema for understanding how the world works. And in organizational studies, there really wasn't a lot on this, although quite early in the 1970s, there had been work on marginality, alienation from sociology. I can say, well, I'm living in Canada, so my French pronunciation comes in, but that's probably not the real reason why I can't pronounce sociology. It might be just it might be just looking at Eleanor Westy and thinking, well, this is her field. But anyway, there was this notion of biculturalism that the field of organization studies had brought into its domain, but it was dropped. And I think it was dropped because it was more seen as in tandem with diversity issues and race and ethnicity management, as opposed to immigration, or wasn't seen as a continuum of identity that we have in organizations. So what I thought of was that we should bring people from a variety of different perspectives to understand this new demographic. At the time, I was living in California. Over 50% of the startups were started up by either Chinese or Indians. The statistics were showing by 2017, which is next year. It was a long time from the 2008 perspective, but actually it's next year, that the entering workforce would be over 40% bicultural. And this is mirrored in Canada, especially in the BC region, especially populated by people coming from Asia, from the two main diasporas. Recent diasporas here in British Columbia are Indian and Chinese. So we had our first think tank in 2008, bringing together social psychologists, organizational scholars, anthropologists, practitioners, and a small group of about 20, a few who are here today, and just to brainstorm who is this new demographic? What do we know about them already from the different fields? How have they experienced their identities growing up? psychologists would say they might be schizophrenic. The research was showing that it depends on how you experienced your biculturalism, whether or not you were integrated or not integrated, how you function in organizations. But really, it's a demographic that's not tracked. Because in the censuses, they don't say, are you bicultural? You know, they don't say, do you have two identities? And so because this is a new phenomena, we wanted to understand more about it. So the first one was really at the micro level, the individual level. Who are these individuals? And then after that, when I went to INSEAD, and I should say that the first think tank was funded by Cisco System, who was very interested in understanding this new demographic in the Silicon Valley. And then when I went to INSEAD, together with Professor Yves Dose, we thought, let's bring this up to another level, and let's bring it up more to the level of the organization and understand what are the skill sets that this group of people bring to the organization. That these are hidden skill sets, because first of all, their identities are hidden, and secondly, we don't know how the different ways in which they've internalized their identities have resulted into differential benefits for the organization. So we felt that these were benefits, hidden skills that would benefit organizations in many ways. And between the 2008 and 2010 conference, lots had happened. There were a couple of dissertations, 3 dissertations, Stacy Fitzsimmons' dissertation being one of them, that was getting into typologies of biculturals. There was a special issue on biculturals that David Thomas and I edited in the International Journal of Cross-Cultural Management. In the meantime, lots of research that was done on adjustment, Rosalie Dung's work, following John Barry, who's one of our speakers today. And so at the time of the 2010 conference, we thought, okay, we're ready now to take it to the meso level of the organization. So we had another think tank in Abu Dhabi. And that was very interesting because, you know, the Emirates is a whole nother panoply of cultures mixed in, including one which is the global cosmopolitan. And so what is the difference between a global cosmopolitan, biculturals, and whatnot? So, and then I've been wanting to have the third think tank for a long time, and we've thought about it. Should we have it in Australia? Should we have it here? Should we have it there? And finally, I think I'm settled down enough to say, okay, I'll do it again, and now we'll do it here in Vancouver, which makes a whole lot of sense, as British Columbia is, as you can tell just walking around the streets, a cauldron or a cradle of immigration. And so a very interesting place to study this phenomenon and to host a think tank like this. And so for today, the agenda really is to bring it now up one other step to the macro level and really have us all think together with practitioners and members from the ministries of the government, so policymakers at the macro level, how can we understand how can we broaden our perspectives, whether we're social psychologists, anthropologists, organizational behavioralists, sociologists, how can we now take what we know about multiculturalism, immigration, mobility, et cetera, and inform policymakers at the country level, and change the world in terms of how immigrants and their progeny are understood and leveraged. And so thank you very much for coming today. I want to thank especially the industry and government representatives who have come on a Saturday in August. I'm beginning to understand that Canada is different from the United States and much more like Europe and France. And that August is don't touch that month, you know, in terms of having something like this. And then to have people from industry use a whole Saturday to do something like this is quite a lot to ask. So I'm really grateful for our industry panel and for the people who've come from industry and from the ministries. So with that's about all I wish to say to start out. And we'll just go on now to our first keynote from Paul Valor. And so we're starting really at the macro, and then going down to the micro in our first two keynotes. So welcome.
All right.
And Rosalie will be introducing
Okay.
our two speakers.
Okay.
First, I'd like to join Mary Yoko and Terry in welcoming you to beautiful British Columbia. I'm the local host here, and as Mary Yoko has suggested, Vancouver is really the confluence of East and West, and you notice that in every aspect of society itself. Their representation of people from every country on the continent, and you will see it in terms of the diversity of our ethnic cuisine, in terms of the different ways things are done. Canada establishes a policy of multiculturalism, which is very different from that of the States of melting pot. And so we'll explore a little bit of what the differences between the two are. So this is one of our campuses, okay? To be building. Our percentage also belongs to Simon Fraser. Then we have another building, which is the old Bank of Montreal building, which is Simon Fraser. And then for those of you that know Vancouver, the old Woodward building is also part of Simon Fraser. So we do have a diversity of campuses. Of course, we have the main campus and one on Surrey, out in Surrey, which is out in the east. Okay, so without further ado, I'll introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Paul Valor, who is the John and Bruce Moody Chair in Law and Business, and of course you might say, why Law and Business? Because Professor Valor hopes to join appointed with both the Carleton School of Management and also the University of Minnesota's Law School. So his current research is in focusing on foreign investment, risk management in developing countries with special interest in migrants and remittance-based venture investment. Professor Valor consults for the World Bank on diaspora engagement in West African countries. He receives his BA in history from Carleton College and MA in philosophy, politics, and economics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and a JD from Harvard, and a PhD in strategic management from the University of Minnesota. So without further ado, otherwise I'll take this whole session.
Yeah, no.
I'll turn it over to Professor Paul.
Thank you, Rosalie, and thank you first to the three institutions and the Academy that are sponsoring this on this beautiful August morning. Thanks especially to Terry, Rosalie, and to Mary Yoko for organizing this. Institutions are important, they support, but nothing gets done unless individuals want to do it. And there's a lot of sweat equity behind the scenes here that we don't know about, and the three of them have been at the forefront. So many, many thanks to you. Now you got to get back and enjoy what's going to happen, okay? Just sit back and let it happen in front of you. Secondly, I want to emphasize Mary Yoko's point about August in Canada. And I speak as a Minnesotan. I'm from the long-lost 11th province of Canada. So August in Minnesota is not to be trifled with. It has a few other kind of trips to it. So it's such a pleasure to be here and enjoy this in the lull before the storm of our academic year. So what I want to talk about today as a scene setter, maybe to provoke some commentary as we think about this issue of migrants and the diaspora and the opportunities for management and policy that goes with it, is to focus it on at least one aspect of it. So it's a macro. We're going to be at about 10,000 feet and talking about broader movements, but they're about people. They're about individuals, the people we were seeing as we walked here today. And the money, the small bits and pieces that crosses the counter is not in hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, but in drips and drabs of $150 that add up to billions. And why they're so important if you're in this room interested in the management and business issues around entrepreneurship in developing countries, if you're interested in the policy issues around that, if you're interested in making some money on this. And I hope, dare say it, never go to a business professor to actually get into business, but I'm going to make a pitch for it anyway on this. And I want to talk about it because I think it's a great scene setter. So, and then tell you a little bit about research and what I think the opportunities are. So I'm going to talk about migrants, remittances, and venture investment in developing countries. And the question is, what can we contribute here in the business school? There's lots of research on this, but I think there's some things that we can do that are really important. I mean, we need to be at the table, research-wise and otherwise. I'm going to make that case for you. So what I want to do, if I can advance this correctly, can I move this down? Am I doing it? Oh, I am moving it. I just don't see it up here. So I'm going to do this look, and then I'm going to look up here now and then to see what it is because my screen's a little different. But if I get hit by a truck in the next minute or two, this is what I wanted to tell you. I wanted to tell you that migrants and their money and ideas are the single most important agents and flows for not just the purposes of business in developing countries, but just development. This is the kind of witch's brew that we need to get the development process going in some of the least developed parts of the world. West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, parts of Central America that have been left behind by the Washington Consensus. And you'd think, how is that possible? The reason is because business research, to some substantial extent, has hardly ever touched this issue. And I want to I'm going to proselytize you, see if I can get you excited about this the way I have been by showing you the kinds of things that we can bring that are distinctive, unique, the novel theories and methods and just questions that we like to ask that aren't getting asked so far with regard to these so important transnational people, money, and ideas. I'm going to show you about some basic issues about remittances and migrants and venture capital and venture foundings of new businesses and just kind of broader internationalization as an appetizer. It's going to be some work that I've done and I've done with some of my colleagues that are here in the room. In fact, research that goes back about 5 years when I was visiting Simon Fraser last time in another beautiful building like this in downtown Vancouver. And then I want to see if I've got your appetite, got your attention, show you some questions, interesting questions that I think have yet to be addressed, that I think are really right up our alley as business researchers, and why they're so important, not just for pushing ahead the academic agenda for entrepreneurship research, especially in developing countries and in the transnational sense, but why they're so important also for policy reasons and for indeed practical business reasons. And I think the main thing is we can contribute new evidence, new ideas. We deserve a place at the table. So with that, let me introduce what I'm talking about. So there's a picture of some of the individuals here that are on your left. They're the individuals that maybe you saw as you were walking down the streets towards Hastings this morning or on Seymour. And then that's the bigger flow. That's the 10,000-foot picture that Mariyoko was talking about. This is the 5th largest country in the world. It's called diaspora. That is, if it were a country. Around 250 million people that have been moving bits and pieces largely between the developing South to the developed North, especially since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and in particular since 2000. What's important about it is not just the sheer numbers of people, it's the money. At about 400 billion, that's billion US dollars a year annually in terms of remittance flows, it's now essentially the largest inflow to most developing countries. And by that I mean get outside of the OECD, get outside of the emerging markets, get to some of the least developed countries that we can think of, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and in Central America, Southeast Asia. But even where it isn't, it's number 2. It's like Avis. It's always trying harder on that thing. And what's important about that is it's not just that it's the dollars that go with it and the people. They're ideas that I can't even begin to add to that number of 400 billion. Right? It's the ideas that comes from the experience of those transnationals that are now living in Europe, sending money back, and ideas about new businesses, and ideas about government, and ideas about the rights of women and people and other things. That's so much more, and that's not caught in here, and it's so important in terms of the flows for it. So why do we care about that? We care about that, I think, because these trickles and dribs and drabs, I'm going to argue for you, are the most important inflow of venture capital. And it's something we just tend to overlook, and I want to talk about why. One thing is about the overall level of these flows and these people. Another thing is about the variance in those flows. We are in the business of not just talking about means, but also of standard deviations and variances. One of the most important aspects of this remittances is about how stubborn they are to things that happen in the macroeconomy. Last time I was here was 2010. We were just coming out of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. As you can see, almost all the international flows to the rest of the world took a huge dive in 2008. Remittances barely paused for a minute before they started their upward movement again. And in fact, every time the World Bank redoes this graph, they have to kind of shift the slope up even more because remittances are crossing that line with foreign direct investment, especially in developing countries. So this is another reason why I think it's so important that we study these people, that we study their money, their ideas, and what they mean for all sorts of phenomena, including the phenomena I want to talk about, which is about venture capital. But question, I said, why is it that business has hardly touched this? And there are lots of different reasons for this. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I play one on TV. No, I'm not one of those. But I'm going to tell you, I have a theory about it. And it's in part because look around you in this room. Look where we are. Look at the kind of individuals we see often in a business school setting, right? Think about the individuals we talk about when we're in the classroom, when we think about things like entrepreneurship and venture capital firms and the like, and then compare them with the individuals I introduced you to at the beginning. They don't look like us. They don't look like us. They look like the people that clean up the place after we leave, the security guards that we have. Where I work at the Carlson School, we're right next to a Somali community that are a part of our community, but not necessarily part of our student group. There's a disconnect. The challenges our notions about these individuals who live with us in the developed North or developed West, coming from the developing countries, and that's what's so important about it. We have to change our views about how we think about entrepreneurs and transnationals and their money. And if we do that, there's some really exciting opportunities for us. And this is where I see it. These individuals that don't look like our milieu, our experience, they're ideal for our research, especially in entrepreneurship. They're so interesting in part because they have this interesting transnationality. They really are kind of jet setters, right? In a world where the cost of transportation and communication has gone down so low that they can move back and forth between their countries, whether they were, 40, 50 years ago, wealthy individuals coming from Australia and New Zealand to Europe and moving back and forth, or Somalis coming to Minnesota and moving back and forth. Both of them are there for it. So they're so fascinating, that transnationality. They're so important also because of our research in many ways liberates us from I say a burden. I say that with the quotes. For much public policy research, we have to ask after welfare questions. Well, to some extent, we don't. Our first question is often about how do firms compete, or investors, how do they do better persistently? We look at the kind of private performance for that. And to some extent, that's liberating, right? We can ask after how well these individuals do without having to ask right first and foremost, what's the impact of what they do on growth? I'm going to show you that the impact of what they do on growth is quite positive and other things, but we don't have to do that. We're liberated from that. And the kinds of theories that we can bring to bear, institutional theories, theories of entrepreneurship, the animal spirits of these individuals, fit so interestingly with them. To some extent, they come as a natural experiment. They come with so little in the way of visible supporting attributes. What they do come with is their human capital, their educations and skills that goes with it, and also their transnational connections. But in many ways, it's a really interesting, naturally occurring experiment. The other thing that's neat about these individuals is we know a lot more about them in the last decade than we did in the previous 30, 40 years in terms of their educational background, the other kinds of training that they've had, where they come from, the concentrations, demography. We can take advantage of that to ask after individual characteristics and structural characteristics that are collective to see how what these people are like affect what their money does when it goes back home, those remittances I'm talking about. Let me give you an example of that as an illustration. So I've been spending some time trying to understand how migrants and their remittances, that's household to household transfers of money or individual to individual transfers. It's not foreign direct investment. It's not portfolio investment. It's certainly not foreign aid. It's people to people money that comes about $100 to $150, $200 US each month steadily from one individual back to another across oceans or across borders for this. And the question is, what's it get used for? Because it's a big amount of money collectively. And the default answer has always been that it's the poor sending money home to the desperately poor. And so it's subsistence for food, clothing, housing. It's to dig a new latrine. It's to fix up the house that goes with it. The last thing, the hierarchy of needs for that, Maslowian, is for starting a new business, because that's a luxury that few entrepreneurs have in terms of the ideas. They have to be extraordinary individuals like Thomas Edison and the like. That's the kind of way we look at this. So as we think about this split, almost all of it's got to go up there on top, and very little, if any of it, goes down there. And there's actually some survey evidence that suggests maybe that's the way things traditionally were, and that's why this should be the province of development economists and the like, and public policy people. Business people go study Sequoia Capital. But look a little more closely, right? These guys don't follow the rules. That is, they don't think about the distinctions between household expenditure and investment as distinct from what I do in my business world, right? For the woman who's selling hair care products out of the back of her house in Uganda with $150 a month she gets from her cousin that's living in Manchester, she doesn't think about, oh gosh, that's the business and that's the household. She doesn't think about, oh, that's a luxury and these are the necessities that I need. She doesn't do those things. Those are one and the same for her. There are kind of dual use investments and assets, like there are dual use technologies and security and the civil use. Also, you know what? She doesn't really need your formal institutions. I get it. And many of you here work with the World Bank. I've done this too. You know, you get your money from the bank when you get rule of law and you get a good, you trust the judiciary and you build up institutions. And I'm all for that. It's like, you know, peace in the Middle East. I want that, right? On the other hand, what are we going to do to get this started? It's kind of catch-22. You don't get the money until you have the institutions, but you need the money in order to support and pay the judges and have that stuff. So I need some way to jumpstart this process of development. These guys are ideal because they care much less for formal institutions. They've already got, as transnationals, family and community, what I call clan and community. They're to assure the intended use of these dribs and drabs of $100 or $150 a month. And now it means they can't just kind of pick any old place to do this investing. They've got to do it where the clan and community are, but that fits pretty nicely, right? It's a reason why these individuals might be both willing and able to send venture money home to some of the riskiest parts of the world to go where angels fear to tread or where Sequoia Capital fears to tread. So let me show you a little evidence to suggest that's just exactly what's going on. These are pictures. Trust me that the pictures are supported by more rigorous statistical evidence with all sorts of boring charts I could give you. Pictures are much more interesting. So on this picture, you have on the x-axis, you have remittances per capita back in the recipient country. So on the far right, that's Lebanon. They get a lot of money. That comes back because the Lebanese are the diaspora of the world, right? Along with the Armenians and the Jews and all the other kind of traditional diasporas. But the big action, the interesting action over in this really simple is in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Central America. You're going from about 0 per capita to about $100 per person in remittances, jumps up your venture capital availability based on this measure, which comes from the Mike Milken Institute, or just about any others you can put up, extraordinarily. It jumps you up in terms of the ranks of capital availability. When you ask individuals whether they're at the bottom of the pyramid or nearer the top, they say, yeah, there's more around it. There's more ideas for it. And these remittances are more than both significantly, they're also substantially associated with changes in their attitudes and changes in real outcomes. This is a little trickier picture I'll show you, but last one's about money, funding. Here's about founding. So this is a little trickier, and I'll just give you a little interpretation. On the x-axis is the state share of the economy. How big is Big Brother in your developing country? And about 15% to 20% of expenditures of GDP is an interesting saddle point for this. The y-axis is the change in the number of new business fundings. This is some data from the World Bank, probably understates substantially real new business funding or foundings in countries. And what's going on here is if you increase remittances about 1 standard deviation from the mean, which is about, $75 a person back in the recipient country. So you jump it up to $105 or $110 or so on that. What happens is as long as government stays out of the way, it's relatively speaking small as a percentage of GDP, you jump up the number of new business foundings very substantially. And again, this is based on official registrations, officially registered. And of course, micro businesses in the developing part of the world are much more than that. So I'm sure I'm underplaying the effects. So what's going on is remittances are associated with the new business funding and new business foundings, both the venture capitalist aspect and then the kind of entrepreneurial, the guy who actually starts it, the woman who starts it, the hair care products I was talking about. Even more so, here's something which is, this is for my policy friends, this is about the relationship between remittances and the internationalization, the economic internationalization of countries. So it's take like your exports and imports and add them up and divide them by GDP, just get a sense of how plugged in is Somalia or Uganda or Kenya or Guatemala in the world economy. And what you find is, again, there's a strong correlation, remittances per capita on the x-axis, this internationalization measure on the y, and it's a really nice positive slope. And again, I can show you all sorts of other analytical results that would suggest that the causation runs from remittances to this internationalization rather than the other way around. And I tell you that because this gives you a sense about not just how these individuals pursuing their self-interest gin up this activity we care about as entrepreneurship and business scholars, but how it has this interesting positive knock-on effect for countries. We want countries to be more open, more engaged in the world economy. We think it's good for their economy, it's good for their polity, it's good for their society. All these things are happening. And I want to emphasize in this research, and in the real tiny type or papers I can aim you at, it happens more to the extent the migrant is less educated. That's right, less educated, not more. It happens more to the extent collectively the diaspora is more concentrated in one or two countries as opposed to like the Lebanese. They're all over the world, or the Armenians, right? So it's, the Mexicans that are concentrated in the US, Turks concentrated in Germany, Algerians and Moroccans concentrated in France. Now, increasingly, more south-south migration. It's individuals in one Central African country that have been displaced because of refugee status and the like, in another one. Where we find concentrated, relatively less educated, we find more of this activity. And I can bring it back to that old story. They don't have these distinctions between home and business, between formal and informal. They don't have time to figure out how we're going to set up rule of law in these countries. They have something else that goes with it, and they don't do it because it's a luxury. They do it because it's a necessity. There is no labor market for them to go to. This is the market, right? This is what they're going to do. They have to create their own job, and we find that these remarkable individuals, these transnational individuals, can do that as funders, as founders, and unwitting or witting agents of internationalization and increased development. It's all the right things we should be studying. Now, you might say, I said this about informality and informal economies. Let me give you a definition and show you how that is even more important. So by informality, I'm going to mean this: the inability to see or regulate business transactions, right? I just don't have enough money for a judiciary or a good regulator. Or even if I did, the people suspect so much the bad faith of that regulator, say it's a former country of the Soviet Union and the like, that they avoid it. So all sorts of transactions that are off the books. And guess what? As that level of activity that's in the informal sector increases, that's the x-axis here at around 45, 46, 47%, kind of the Mitt Romney number on that. When it goes up above that, that's when these remittances become even more important to venture funding and venture founding, internationalization. So they kind of put it all together. I have a concentrated, less educated, but very hungry diaspora abroad. I have informality at home. I have some ability to communicate from the standpoint of money through banks, through money transfer organizations, or the Hawala. And that's the way we get the process of development started. That's the way we do it, through entrepreneurship, through starting new businesses and the like. Just a few more things. It's not just about how good they are at the transactions. In doing this, they also have a beneficial effect on the kind of underlying business norms. This is work I'm doing now with my, I was going to say soon-to-be former doctoral student, Michael Cummings, who's here today. So ask all the hard questions to Michael on this. But this is a relationship between per capita diaspora, remittances in the home country, and on the x-axis, or the y-axis, is kind of the home country governance quality. So it's an average of some responses in the World Competitiveness Survey that every year that Klaus Schwab does. Things like, what do you think about corporate governance, labor relations? And so what you find is these remittances, especially if they come from countries that have better measures on this, like, I don't know, again, the US and Canada, for that, then the quantity and the quality of remittances also has this apparently a knock-on effect, a non-trivial knock-on effect of underlying business norms, right? I have created a lobby of people back home who get money from abroad, and they care about the garbage getting picked up, the judge not being overly corrupt, politicians actually doing what they're saying, or kind of, right? These are all good things, and this is building on research that we see about the beneficial role of migrants and remittances in other areas, having to do with women's rights, having to do with the role of women in families, having to do with voting rights and ideas about democracy. So this is nothing new, but it's another one of these dividends of the diaspora. Couple things. I said I was going to be practical. I got about 2-3 minutes to do that, and then I'll stop. So what can we do in business? There's money to be made. I tell you, 3 minutes, I did it right? There's money to be made in this, but so as Rosalie said, I got funded for 2 years in Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship. Cecil Rhodes made a bunch of money in the diamond business, but he was not a diamond miner. He sold equipment to the diamond miners. So the way to make money, my friends, is to be selling equipment, to provide the infrastructure for these remittances in the host country, to be a part of the banking system or the money transfer organization systems for this. Western Union was a company on its knees in 1975, 1980, and remittances saved these cats. Or MoneyGram, which is based in Minneapolis, or RIA Financial for this. Also banks. The banks have made a big deal about this. But they're so interesting because so many of these individuals are unbanked, so money transfer organizations, informal Hawala-based organizations are where the money is. What's really neat is, of course, you need just a basic banking system and telecommunications system in the host country or in the home country. You don't need much, but you do need something there. One of the most interesting and exciting areas to get involved with now is in so-called mobile remittances, where, say, African telecommunications carriers in South Africa are teaming up with West African banks to provide a way to get money to especially remote areas where not only do they not have banks, they don't have even post offices and the like. So it's a way to send the money electronically. Look at these two things on the left and right of my little picture. This is in the Philippines. This country has been so innovative about this. If I walk in and I say I want to send $100 back to Manila, and they say, is it for education fees? One of the most popular reasons. And you say, well, yeah, it's the end of August, right? It's about time to pay for school. They'll say, we have this provider who's gone out and bought in bulk seats in private schools. And for your $100, if you want to do it, and if you're willing to send your kid to one of these schools, we'll give you $105 in school fees. That's education. That's from this My Remit One. You can do it for groceries, for building a loan. There are all these neat value-added businesses that are there. And for us as business researchers, this is great gold to be looking at how pioneers are selling and creating the infrastructure to value enhancement. One other thing, and then I'll close up. There's a role for government here. And one of the ways, I want to be a cynic and say the first role of government is do nothing, right? But I really would like you to think about doing nothing as a first step. So in the United States, we do lots of things that are really dumb for this. So the latest dumb idea coming from my now former Congressman, Michelle Bachmann, was to tax remittances that go abroad, which is a dumb idea because it brings down the rate of remittances and it sends remittances underground. We even have dumber ideas to tax them only if they can't produce documentation. That's a really dumb idea for that. But we have other good ideas that are out there, simple ideas, providing for dual citizenship, allowing for a little more lighter-handed touch of regulation of the financial institutions that provide this important service, but we care about it from a national security standpoint. There's smart things that we can do, and I think one of the other things that we can do is we can encourage or not discourage the creation of diaspora engagement institutions. And by that I mean both formal ones in the home countries, say a ministry for migrants living abroad along as a part of the foreign ministry, or in the host countries, something like the Indus Entrepreneur, or other kinds of organizations that might even be kind of quasi-governmental institutions or even private institutions, to give a sense of what identity is and to give a sense also of information and connection between these migrants in the home and host country. So doing non-dumb things is an important thing, and there's some smart things that government can do. And I'd love to talk more about that if there are questions and the like as we talk about things during the day. I think for us as business schools, the biggest thing we can do are captured right here. Spend more time with our colleagues next door in the public policy and the law schools. This is an issue where they're still the dominant player in research, but we have new ideas, and it's important for us to learn what the arguments and debates are. That's where it is. Spend more time with business schools that are there on the ground. If you're in North America, it means Latin America. If you're in Europe, it means Sub-Saharan Africa. If you're anywhere else, Asia is for all of us because it's so important and because the Asian diasporas are all over. And I think the last thing about it is spend more time with industry players like today, money transfer organizations, banks, other players, and government officials who are tasked with embracing these players, these transnational players, and money for public policy purposes. We can do really important things, and we need to be there at the table. We have the really great ideas for this, and I look forward to your questions, your comments, and I want us to have a great day. I hope I've provoked some issues and arguments for you. Thank you.
I was told that I need to speak at the podium so that it will be recorded, so it's not that I want to go to the podium.
And let me just say right before, can you hear me? We're going to go right into now for something completely different, from macro to micro, and so that we can then have a collective discussion from both of these perspectives before our coffee break.
Our second keynote speaker for this morning is Ying-Yi Hong, who is Professor of Psychology and holds the Kennan Professor of Management at the Nanyang Business School, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Professor Hong is a recognized expert on culture and cognition, multicultural identity, and intergroup relations, of course, a topic that we'll focus on. Like myself, she grew up in Hong Kong, one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and received her PhD from Columbia University. Prior to joining Nanyang Technological University, she has taught at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Professor Hong is a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science and the Society of Experimental Social Psychology. She is the author of 100 journal articles and book chapters and is the editor of over 10 books. She currently serves as the editor of Advances in Culture and Psychology series published by the Oxford University Press. Without further ado, Professor Hong.
Good morning. Thank you, Mariyoko, Rosalie, and Terry for inviting me. And thank you for attending my talk early in the morning, Saturday morning in August. Yeah, I really appreciate that. So now we need to go into, actually, can I talk in front?
Yeah. Can we get the portable mic?
Because I'm much shorter, so it's easier for you to see me. Otherwise, I will be buried behind the podium. Can you hear me? Is this on? Okay, all right. Yeah, so I think by now, I don't need to convince you that migration is happening and happening rapidly as well. So in the past 2-3 decades, we see double, triple number of migrants. And for various reasons, for example, there are professionals, expatriates, there are more and more multinational companies. For retirement, now actually many retirees choose to live in or retire in a foreign countries. And then students study abroad programs and also family reunion. And for all these, now the grand challenge question is how, when, and whom would benefit from bi- and multicultural experience. In my talk today, I'm going to share with you some of my research, and mainly they cover these areas. First, I want to convince you that culture matters. Culture really lives and imprints in individuals. I can show you some data even from neuroimaging. But the good news is that cultural influence is not deterministic, it is dynamic. And I'll show you also experiments and data on that. And multicultural influence can be beneficial, but not for all people and not under all circumstances. So I will tell you when and how. And then finally, how do we use research on this topic to facilitate individual development and also intergroup relations? So let's start. There was one research that got me really, really interested in people's brain. And this is the research on London taxi driver. So there was research published in 1999, and it convincingly demonstrated that taxi drivers developed a larger hippocampus area, the area in the brain that specializes in spatial representation, the longer they are on the job. Okay? And not long after, actually published in Nature, they find that people who juggle regularly, develop denser gray matter than participants who do not juggle. And then the longer they juggle, the more gray matter they developed. So maybe at the end of today, you want to go home and try and do, And what it says is that experience matters. It can affect your brain structure. Now, if that is the case, then different cultures have different lay theories, practices, and norms. And therefore, people from different cultures will have different experience, and thus, they might have different neurological responses in different contexts. And what it says is culture should matter as well. Now, one research that have famously demonstrated this is Dick Nisbach's group at U of Michigan, they look at how people look at pictures like this. And especially they compare Chinese and North Americans. And what they find is that they use eye trackers, and also they use other methods. They find that Americans focus more on the focal object, for example, the plane here, whereas Chinese focus more on background, okay? And when we saw this research, we got very interested. My colleagues at that time, Dennis Park and I thought, okay, can we also demonstrate this in people's brain by scanning their neural activities? So we went about and then recruit 16 Chinese and 16 Euro-Americans. These Chinese, I have to tell you more about them. They were just right off the plane, arriving at UIUC, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So that's where we conduct the scanning. So we have these 16 Chinese who just arrived in the United States, who all spoke Mandarin. And we matched them with 16 Euro-Americans. And we scanned them while we show them a bunch of pictures. So what they need to do is just look at pictures. They don't need to respond. And there were different types of pictures we showed them. One type is we call novel concurrent, repeat concurrent. I will explain what they are. Novel incongruent and repeat incongruent. What I meant by novel concurrent is that each time the pictures will be shown, 4 pictures will be shown at one block quickly. And the novel concurrents are pictures in which both the focal objects and the background changed, okay? But it's concurrent because the focal object and the background are in a typical pairing. For example, a camel in the desert, a deer in the jungle, okay? And then repeated concurrent is the control for that, yeah. And what usually people find is that if you show people the same stimuli over and over again, your brain gets bored. So you start slow down in firing. So for example, these pictures like that, repeated concurrent, by the end of the 3rd and 4th showing, your brain will quiet down quite a bit, okay? Now, novel incongruents are our target stimuli, which is the focal object and the background appeared in a bizarre way, okay? So I think you seldom see a cow in front of the elevator lobby, right? Yeah, you don't see that quite often or never, before. And this is where we thought that actually the Chinese brain will keep firing, okay? Because the background and the foreground or the focal objects appeared in a bizarre way. For Americans, because they focus on the focal object, so their brain will quiet down pretty quickly or quicker than the Chinese, okay? And now the repeated incongruent was the control for the novel concurrent. So our predictions was that if Chinese were really focusing on the background, their brain activities, especially the part that I'll show you in a moment, that is responsible for object processing, will keep firing, okay? It's as though they freak out, okay, in that sense. Now, so that was what's happening if you were in the scanner. So you just saw, these pictures. And we scanned all 16 Chinese and 16 Euro-Americans, and across all 32 participants, there was no significant difference in terms of the area that got activated. So they were very nicely in the natural hospital complex, left and right. So there's no structural difference. However, we find what we predicted, especially, for example, here is the Chinese. This is a left LOC, right LOC, the brain. And in both left and right, you see the incongruent got bigger magnitude. That means actually they were much more bored by the bizarre pairing, okay? Now, The summary of this is that Chinese participants were more sensitive to contextual incongruence than were Americans, and they also react more to the incompatible pairing and focusing greater attention. The Americans focus more on the focal object. But so what? What are the implications? This was a nice demonstration, but what was the implications? There were no cultural, first, there were no cultural differences in which brain area was activated. So that means there's no constitutional difference. There's no, I'm not claiming that the American brain and the Chinese brain differ. However, they differ in terms of strategies, all right? And now the critical question is, could this be changed? Okay, indeed, yes. And biculturals have two sets, and they could be primed one way or the other. And there were evidence that showing that their neural activities change as a function of the cues that they were receiving. And all these start from a theory that we proposed about 15 years ago. We call it dynamic constructivist approach to culture. And what we contend was after extensive exposure to multiple cultures, individuals can develop multiple systems and they can switch between these cultural frames. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an illustration. For example, we say Chinese-American biculturals. What we propose is that they have representation of both American and Chinese cultural system in their brain. And here is metaphorical only. I don't mean that the American culture is here in the frontal lobe and then the Chinese in the occipital lobe. I don't mean that, but it's the conceptual representation. And now you can, through experiments we call cultural priming, by presenting stimuli or symbols of a certain culture to activate the accessibility of certain culture. For example, here the Great War activating the accessibility of Chinese cultural knowledge, or the Statues of Liberty activating American cultural knowledge. And so in the typical experiments, we randomly assigned participants in to one of these priming conditions by showing them different cultural icons or symbols, and then observe their subsequent behaviors. And in the past, actually, we have used the same methodologies to look at various things, including, for example, behaviors. So we can put, here in this study, we use Hong Kong Chinese. The argument is that they are also biculturals because they grew up in, at that time was in colonial British Hong Kong. So we first present them with either the Chinese, American, or the neutral icons, and then observe their behaviors in a prisoner's dilemma game. So typically, in a prisoner's dilemma game, Chinese people would cooperate more with their friends, with the expectations that their friends would cooperate too. So in-group, out-group make a big difference. So the Chinese would cooperate more, and to the extent more than Americans, but only to friends, not to strangers or out-groups. And so we put participants through the experiments, and what we find was exactly what was typically found in a cross-cultural study. So the light blue here indicate in-group. When the participants were playing with in-group members, their friends, the vertical axis is the percentage of cooperation, and then in the 3 priming conditions. So you can see when the participants were primed with the Chinese culture, when they were playing with the in-group friend, they have significantly more tendency, likelihood to cooperate than the American culture prime, and neutral was in between. But with the out-group, actually you don't see that, okay? So here is typical, priming, and then we see the observed differences. But the point is that people seems to be able to switch between, and it's very specific and context specific as well. So in the past 15 years, actually we have demonstrated this over and over in different domains. for example, cognition, internal, external attribution, behavior, like what I told you, and affect as well. Now, another thing, the recent development, Fiona, Ni, and Chiang, are here. They have developed research that look at how biculturals perform in creative tasks. And it makes a lot of sense because biculturals have two sets of tools, cultural tools, cultural frames, and creativities, it oftentimes requires combination of diverse views. And indeed, what they find is that biculturals are more creative than monoculturals in their studies. So by now, I hope that I have convinced you that by exposing to multicultural experience or multiple cultures, you acquire multiple representations. But this is just half of the story, because oftentimes when you see biculturals, they also report experiences of being fragmented in their self. For example, here is from a Filipino painter. Her painting here a racial identity crisis. So it portrays herself as divided between the two cultural traditions. One is the colonial, the other is her indigenous identity. So oftentimes, the other half of the story is when you are exposed to multiple culture, you ask, who am I? Okay? So this is what I call multicultural self. You need to react towards the cultures, different cultures, and try to identify or find the place where you belong. Okay? Thank you. Now, how to choose? Oftentimes you see close encounters with foreign cultures can also evoke hot exclusionary responses. One example is Starbucks. Starbucks was forbidden in the Forbidden City, okay? And what is the story about? It doesn't mean that Chinese don't like coffee. And indeed, actually, there are more and more Starbucks opening up in mainland China. But the problem was the one in the Forbidden City. And in 2007, an anchorman for China Central TV wrote in his blog, the shop's presence in the Forbidden City was not globalizing, but tumbling over Chinese culture. So many Chinese people respond to this and agreeing. So at the end, the Starbucks there, actually you can hardly see, it doesn't really show the regular features of Starbucks. But at the end, in 2007, the Starbucks coffee closed its shop in Forbidden City. And now, actually, they have another coffee shop, but a more local coffee shop there. So it doesn't mean Chinese doesn't like coffee, but it's like a foreign culture coming into your own culture. Yeah, that would elicit hot responses. So what would predict a hot and cool responses? Researchers, actually, we ourselves look at a particular variables. We call racial essentialism theory. This theory is defined by people who believe that race reflects inherent accents. It biologically determines a person's trait and ability. So we have studied this quite extensively in the past 10 years, and we have a lot of evidence showing that people who believe in that will have a harder time to switch between cultural frames, show lower creativity, and also dislike mixing cultures. So this idea about racial essentialism actually is embraced by quite a number of people. So we can measure them by showing them a questionnaire and asking them to what extent they agree. And usually, for example, in the past, I have surveyed over 1,000 American students. You see a lot more distributions, meaning some people disagree while others agree with it quite a bit. Now, even in Singapore, I have also tried out. Some people agree, some don't. And the good thing is a normal distribution, and it's the best for researchers. And another way, actually, in my lab, we can convince people about one idea or the other. So, for example, in this article, The Mystery of Race, there is essence underlying social groups. The concept of race has divided humankind into meaningful social groups based on differences in their innate qualities. So this was shown, and participants, usually undergraduate students, were told that, oh, you know, this is from Times magazines. Why don't you read this and tell us what this essay is about? Or they are shown the other one, The Mystery of Race. The meaning of race is socially constructed. It is used to characterize different social groups. So the argument, the purest one, was on racial essentialism, whereas the other is more social constructive, okay? But actually, we wrote the essay, yeah, and it was made up by us. But it was, you know, shown as a prestigious, you know, essay, and there were a lot of empirical research that's reported there, yeah, convincingly. And we debriefed the participants at the end, yeah. So they knew that it was a forced, you know, bogus, yeah, article. Now, by reading that, what people change? And actually, we find all sorts of interesting outcomes. One is for Asian Americans, we find that if you look at the cultural identification, after they read the articles, for example, for people who read Race Essentialist, you see that their American culture identification lowered than the social construction. And also, actually, one very interesting thing we find recently, and we published, is on creativities. So earlier I showed that Fiona and Chiying have shown biculturals can combine different ideas and become more creative. So if they were shown the story, the racial essentialism, they will divide it because there's no way for the two ideas to combine. And indeed, we ran many studies, and one of it was with Jewish Israeli undergrads. So we showed them the different essays, and then afterwards, we asked them to work on the remote association test, which is a common measures of creativity. So what the participants need to do is what's the common thread linking these three concepts: manner, round, and tennis. So they have to come up with this table. And melon, mineral, and four. What's that? Yes, water. Yeah. So that's the way that the participants need to perform. And indeed, if you look at the red bar here, is the participants who just read the essentialist essay, okay? And then the control and social constructivists show much higher creativity or much more problem solved on this task. And we use different tasks. For example, this is the Duncan candle problem. So participants were shown, okay, thank you, the problem here, and then they have to come up with a solution. So again, the red bar is essentialist and social constructives. And so maybe one more minute, to show the last one that we are doing now is looking at how people respond to mixing of culture. In the globalized world, we see a lot of products or things that are mixing. And how do people respond to it? So we create these stimuli in our lab. For example, the Lincoln Memorial, the statues was replaced with Mao's head. And then pictures like that. And we show in our experiment, we show first the pure American, pure Chinese side-by-side pictures, and they combined. And again, we find it over and over again. People feel most disgust. We asked them to self-report the disgust feeling. They feel most disgust with the mixed stimuli. But the interesting thing is that racial essentialists actually predict the extent of disgust. So the horizontal axis is racial essentialism. We measure them. The higher they score on racial essentialism, the more disgust they felt. But it's only on the mixed. So it's very specific. On mixing culture, they dislike it. If they hold racial essentialism. Now, oops. other side, right? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Means you're done.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Just one more. Yeah, I just want to show the take-home message. Yeah, if I may. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. Let me find it. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So just the last page here. So what I want to tell you to conclude all the things that I show you is that culture does not rigidly determine an individual's connection, although we see, imprint in it. But instead, with the right mindsets, culture can be resources for enhancing flexibility and creativity. So that's the take-home message I want to convey to you. And thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for leaving time for questions and a lively discussion. So now it's time for you to synthesize these two talks. And I've already thought, here we are in the most gluten-free friendly part of the world. And I'm thinking, there's a hamburger I can eat, and I'm thinking, so, that would be a way of combining the two talks in terms of making money off of this new hybrid product. So we have time for questions, lots of time for questions, and then we're going to go into a 15-minute coffee break that we can keep talking about it. And so what I would like to ask is, if you have a question, please go up to the mic so we can capture this on our video recording.
So while that's happening, can I just suggest something? I'd really like to be on Yi Ying's Human Subjects Review Board. I mean, just wouldn't it be entertaining?
Thanks.
And
Thank
please
you.
identify yourself.
Yeah, my name is Zelango. I'm from the University of Victoria. Thank you very much for two wonderful presentations. Makes this Saturday morning worthwhile. I don't even need Starbucks coffee to wake up now. It's very good. I have a question for Paul, and I'll try to link it with the other presentation as well. Very good information about the nuance between household use of money, the remittance that go, and the investment one, how that's kind of blurred for these ones, and the connection between funding and founding. Do we have data on how long these ventures actually last, the failure rates of these ones? Because we talk about usually mortality rates of new enterprises, and the fact that they are blurred, does it actually offer an advantage? Is there something that we in entrepreneurship on this side can learn from how they actually engage in that? Maybe they are juggling the two, denser gray matter, so that maybe they are being more effective.
First off, thanks for the question. Secondly, the answer is not that I know of. I always have that line. You don't want to say no because there's somebody out there that's done it. This line of research goes back so many more years before anyone from business, me or others, got into it. Alejandro Portas was writing in the late 1970s, early 80s about so-called enclave entrepreneurialism in Little Havana in Miami, and would talk about this and study this through survey and interview. And so to go to sociologists like Portas and others might provide at least a partial answer that would be around micro experiences, anecdotal. But I would say on a broad cross-country basis, such as I was providing here, that we don't know the answer about survival on this. What I do think is going on, and some of my research now suggests, is that there's an interesting sorting between the kinds of migrants who are more likely to be venture funders and those that are more likely to be venture founders. And I'll just give you the brief breakdown of it, which is migrant remittances are a total number, and then in many countries, increasingly in developing countries, we break it out into three buckets, the largest of which is remittances that come from individuals who live abroad for more than a year, legally or illegally. We call that workers' remittances in the old days. There's a second, that's about 3/4 of the total. There's a second that's almost another quarter, almost all of it, which is called, traditionally it was called compensation of employees. It was like seasonal workers, the wine workers in Europe, who were abroad but not for a year. And then there's a last part. I'll just leave that off for a moment unless there are questions about household transfers. In my work, at least as we're looking at now, this is some work with Michael, is there's a suggestion that there's that the money that comes from the people who live abroad as residents is more likely to be effective as for venture funding purposes, and the stuff that comes from individuals who are more circulating, more for founding. So if there's a kind of a brain circulation and an entrepreneurial motive, the person who actually runs the business with that kind of money, that kind of migrant, follows the money. And I think that's an interesting insight that I'm trying to follow up on now.
You could probably do that here in Vancouver.
I could get it done right now. Stick around. I'll work on it
Those
now.
of us who live around here could, have it seems to have face value ability. Other questions? Don't be shy. Yeah, Charles and then Fiona. You can queue up.
Just a question, I was just sitting here thinking, tying those two together, and you mentioned how there are some changes in the home country from the remittances and from the changes, and thinking about your bicultural and how you define biculturals, and what might be a transmission mechanism. Are people becoming more bicultural or changing their identities back home based on these types of interactions?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, great question. I think the way that we define bicultural, especially myself, is very liberal. So I define it by the number of years, usually 3 to 5 years living in a foreign country. And so I think, for example, the activities that you just mentioned would be a very important practices that get the migrants to be connected back home. Yeah, and it's very important. For example, I observe a lot of Chinese nationals living in Singapore. Yeah, and I'm not sure whether they send money home, but nonetheless, they got connected with home through all kinds of social media and other type of telecommunication, and it's a very important source for them to feel secure. Yeah. Recently, I started also looking at people's emotion when they are under stress, and especially immigrants. Yeah, there are all sorts of difficulties that they face in the host culture, and constantly. When they are under stress, one way I see that they try to cope with the stress is to connect back home. And so I think it's very much like what we call, what we know in attachment theory. So your home culture, your native culture is like a mother to you. So when you are exploring outside, when things go well, that's fine. But when you're under stress, actually you run back home. I kind of, try to get the security or the protection of your mother. So in a way, getting, money back home actually is a way that they secure the relationship back home. Make sure that. Even when they are physically not present, there are ways that people back home can be, or motivated to be connected to them, and they at the same time have a way to be connected with folks at home.
I was so glad that Yi Ying's first anecdote was about a cab driver. So I'm going to sound, when I go to and from the airport in Minneapolis, and this is, I don't mean to sound stereotypical or put downish, all the cab drivers, or nearly all, are Somalians. It's just something the Somali people have come and done. So I do a little anecdotal research when I get in the cab. At first they think I'm from the INS or something, but I say, so, how long you been here? When did you last send money home? What'd you send it home for? And it captures, I do, why not, right? I say, oh, I'm from, they pick me up, they know I'm probably not
out of the taxi.
Right, so, but I do, and then I tell them what I do for a living, and they start talking, and there's the creativity of I wrote down your biculturalists are more creative, and I see that because they say, well, of course I sent money home. I sent it to my cousin back in Mogadishu, and I said, what are you doing with it? Well, we got a truck to I go, why? He goes, well, because we need it for the farm. And are you using it for a business? Oh, no, not at all. It's for the farm. And I said, well, what does he do with it during the day? Well, it's a farm, and what does he do that night? He goes, well, he gives it to his cousin, and they run it as a taxi. That's a great That's an example. This is so it's creative, and obviously he sent the money home knowing that was going on, but he doesn't think in terms of these distinctions of household and business, and yet it's happening, and it's unregistered. It'll never show up anywhere, but it's just as important as Steve Jobs, maybe more so in terms of not just building a life for them, but building the institutions and economic activity in that country.
This is great. So this is exactly the strengths that this demographic brings to the organization are hidden, and then the strengths that it brings to the countries and that they're from, as well as that they go to, are also, for a large extent, especially the countries that they're from, are hidden. And so the more we can have these kind of dialogues, the more we can understand that these strengths are there and contributions are there, and maybe track them and bring them to the purview of institutions and governments. Fiona.
Hello, okay. This thing on? Okay, not terribly well. Anyway, question for both of you. Question for Professor Hong first. Both talks really wonderful and really fascinating for me from my perspective, but your last point about people being made anxious by the culturally mixed pictures comes as absolutely no surprise to a structuralist anthropologist when there have been studies for decades showing that just the idea of mixing categories, anything, can produce very violent reactions. So my first question is, how can you how can we control to be sure that this is anxiety about culture per se, and not just the kind of hindbrain structuralist, it's mixed, reaction, and deal with it? And my question for Paul actually relates to your last point about, these multitasking entrepreneurs and your Steve Jobs comparison, which is, why are we so surprised? We do this sort of thing all the time. I don't know an academic that isn't doing 2 or 3 consultancies and has another 2 or 3 ideas and projects on the go. So why are we surprised? And why do we make divisions between blue-collar and white-collar migrants when, if you actually get down to it, the behavior of blue-collar and white-collar migrants is so very much the same when you take out the sort of trappings of, who sends money where and for what?
Yeah.
Thank you both.
And how much?
Thank you, Fiona. Great question. So actually, I didn't show you all the conditions that we had. Yeah. Thanks for allowing me to explain. Yeah, and actually, we have various different conditions. So I only show you the cultural mixing. We also have perceptual mixing condition, in which we show the pictures that you saw earlier. Yeah, so it's a mismatch of the focal object and the background. And also we have another set that have American mixing. So it's like the Statues of Liberty, instead of holding on the torch, she was holding a hamburger. Okay? Yeah, so both were iconic of American culture, but it's American mixing. So you're right that people feel uncomfortable and disgust when there are mixed images. But nonetheless, the individual differences variable didn't predict the disgust. For example, the last graph I showed you about the racial essentialism. So in that graph, only the racial essentialism predict a higher disgust for the mixed. But in all those other type of mixed, racial essentialism didn't predict. There was no systematic effect, aside from everybody feel uncomfortable with the mixed. Yeah. So you're right, but also here, the main thing, I think the main point is that certain mindsets really get you more disgust or more uncomfortable with cultural mixing. Yeah.
So if I had Ying's methods and knowledge, and I could do an experiment with all of you the way she does with the cow and and I were to start saying things like international venture capital, developing country entrepreneurs, job creators, and I had 2 sets of pictures, and the first set were those pictures of the guy rubbing the McDonald's and working in the knitting factory and smiling faces I showed you at the beginning. And I showed you the ones with Mitt Romney and Sequoia Capital, and there would be much. I suspect there would be much greater dissonance. You'd say that doesn't fit when I showed you those remarkable individuals who work those tough jobs, as opposed to the individuals we tend to see professionally, and that's why we're surprised. After you provide the evidence, after I prime you a little bit, and you go, oh yeah, they're like me, especially for those of you who are not native-born Canadians or U.S. here. You kind of know this already, except you're really exceptional. You are tremendously privileged elites here, be able to do this. That's why we should be surprised. But once we get past it, wow, they are like us. They are doing interesting things.
Would we have time for one?
Yeah, Terry has a question. I don't know if you could just turn that on. Or, yeah, okay. While he's walking up, it was something about Vancouver, even more than San Francisco, which is my other stomping ground, is that it is so full of these kind of mixed images, like Japadog. Have you seen the Japadog truck? Or any, it seems like most of the ethnic food is this kind of, shocking combination, And I'm just wondering, how long do you have to live in Vancouver before it's not shocking to see these things? And what does that mean about the French, European, British Columbians, and Indian and Chinese British Columbians? That it would be, this is ripe for study to apply that here.
This question's mainly for Professor Hong. There's also been quite a lot of research indicating that speaking a foreign language has the same outcomes as your bicultural, multicultural research has, in that it promotes creativity, flexibility. This is bad news for native English speakers in the room who don't speak a foreign language, possibly, but maybe it's good news, I don't know. I mean, is there any indication that the process of, the two processes are mutually necessary? So, for example, if you tested native speakers of English who are located in other English-speaking environments, it could go for any other language too, of course. It could go for Spanish people moving to Spanish-speaking countries, whether you get the same outcomes from those as you get from the biculturals that you've studied.
Excellent question. Thank you, Terry. Indeed, actually, language is a big vehicle or carrier of cultural knowledge and also identity. So there are researchers who use language as the prime. Yeah, so they use, especially they look at bilinguals, and then use the two different languages as the prime. And so your question is about monolingual, right? Yeah, monoculturals. And in the past, usually they were ideal for cross-cultural research because they are not contaminated. Yeah, in a way, because they only speak one language, and then so they will be more typical representatives from that native culture. But recently, there were research by Daphne Oyserman, and her colleagues using monolinguals, but then primed their different self. So the argument is that for each individual, regardless of where you come from, in your culture, there are more individualistic self, and there are more collective self. And then so through different ways of activating the individual versus the collective, then you see a quite different responses. So that's possible, but it's not the classical culture thing that we talk about, especially in my own research, because the cultural system also include historical representation as well. And so I doubt whether monoculturals would have access to two different historical representations. But a great question is, it has been empirically dealt with, sort of. Thank you.
And this really touches on a sensitive issue that many of us that are more the micro researchers here face when we bring the individual research up to the level of the organization, where there's sensitivity among people who think of themselves as monoculturals and think that, well, then they're not as good as the biculturals. If the biculturals are more creative, but the biculturals are all these other wonderful things. So there are practical issues that we need to consider in terms of taking the step from this kind of research into the organization and then at the policy level, which is what our next panel is all about.
Absolutely.
And so now we have a 15-minute break. You can stand up, do some sun salutations or some video exercises, or you can go and have some fruit kebabs for your
I have a
break.
question for you.
Thank you.
And then we start back here at 10:30.